we're recording, so here we go. Hello, friends. Welcome to Dialogues in Humanities. I'm Tony Kashani, a fellow at FHDA Center for Applied Humanities. My guest today is Mustafha Dhada, a world-renowned historian and sculptor, affectionately known by his friends and colleagues as simply Dhada. Dhada is a prolific artist and a prolific historian. And there's so much to talk about his work, about his contributions to the field, and all the rest of it. I just want to highlight, before we get started, one of his books, which to me has been monumental in terms of its contribution to the field of history. And I'm hoping that we can talk about the role of the historian, the way in which historians work, and all the rest of it, and see to what extent we can gain a deeper understanding of the place of history in all of humanity. What I have here is from very long bio, so I figured, in our dialogues with Dhada, he would fill in the blanks about his background and so on, and we can get more familiar with each other and so forth. His book, The Portuguese Massacre of Viriamo in Colonial Mozambique, 1960 to 2013, which was published by Bloomsbury Academic Press in 2017, won the American History Association's Martin A. Klein Award for the most distinguished scholarly text in African history in 2017. The genius of Dhada's meticulously researched, the multi-layered account is twofold, said the Klein jurors. It places the grisly massacre in historical context, expands historical knowledge, and perfects methods to produce a definitive social history of Viriamo. Presently, Dhada has been telling me that he is working on a book. His latest book's title, if I'm not mistaken, and he can correct me if I make a mistake here, is called The Voice Digger Beneath the Wall of Silence, a historian in colonial Africa, 1951 to 2020. And I'm hoping that we have an opportunity to discuss the book a bit as well. Welcome, Dhada.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us the honor and the privilege to speak with you. I was just thinking, you have a long history, a historian with a storied history. Could you just talk about how did you get here? What sort of lived experiences have shaped who you are as a historian, then as a human being that strives to live this infinite life?
Well, the part about asking how did I get here as a historian is much easier to answer than the part about as a human being, I think. And I imagine that you are asking the question, how and why did I become a historian? And, what propelled you, not necessarily from the point of view of market influences, of other historians on your work or on your methods of doing history, but rather how the lived experience, shaped not only your sense of both beingness inside, which of course always tinctures both your pen and the discipline that you choose and the subject matter that you choose. I mean, and in a way that brings me back to under normal circumstances, historians don't spend time looking at those kind of questions. They're just far so busy engaging in historiography that it's they don't actually take a pause and look back and say, well, why is it that I am interested, in this field, and how, to what extent, are my methods being propelled by, factors that drive me to do what I do. The occasion that, rather, three incidences, I think, in my very recent life has, propelled me to start thinking about those questions. Historians, nowadays fashionably call it, positionality. Where are you in the text that you are investigating, or in the text that you are constructing arguments with which to understand the past, in the context of a larger body of literature in the field. But the three factors that impacted the writing of the last book, for instance, was that when I published the Portuguese massacre of the Riamo in colonial Mozambique, I had circulated the earlier draft among my students, because I teach a course on the history of African decolonization. And the book, of course, is indeed, makes grisly reading. I mean, chapters 9 and 10 are really exhaustively painful for experiencing, what happened moment by moment, on that eventful afternoon on the 16th of December 1972. But my students urged me to consider producing eyewitness accounts and transcripts on the basis of which I had written the book. And so I, at that point, had just decided I had enough of, investigating massacres and atrocities, etc. And my cardiologist has said, I think you've got to stop this because, it is going to have an impact on you. And indeed it did in the end. But at that point, I buckled under the pressure. After all, as historians, we are also not only practitioners in the field, but that, we do have an obligation to society in creating critical thinkers who would be conscientious enough to understand their role and duties as part of a larger civil society. And so I had to listen to that call from the students, and so I put together a monograph that basically docked under the Martin Klein Award book, and it had a set of curated 24 eyewitness accounts, which I transcribed and interjected and interpolated, with where I had to because of paraphrasing or because of field note deficiencies.
Yeah, I wonder though, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was just thinking to what extent this work also brought you back to your childhood.
Right, so I was coming to that, and I was thinking, so that book really hit a nerve among the next iteration of my students, who now had 2 books. And, curious minds are never satisfied or happy, quite rightly, because that's the very nature of a curious mind. And so the next batch of the students asked the most forbidding question, which most historians, would really sort of shirk from, which is, well, Professor Dhada, we know what happened to the Riamo. We now know, we have primary sources and evidence to glean from, as what happened from their point of view. But where are you in the text? Because it asks the question, why did you do this work? What propelled you to do it? Why these methods? And why such a grisly, a subject matter? Well, that basically forced me to start writing at the intellectual level. Writing a book on positionalities in historiography. But then I realized I am actually speaking to the converted in the church pew, because I don't know that I really need to talk to the converted. I think that what I needed to do is possibly to write and speak about the subject matter to a broader audience, and so that the broader general public will understand man's man's sort of behavior, or despicable behavior, to fellow men or fellow humans. Well, I started writing furiously, and then I think another sort of clangor was dropped. I was having, as a matter of fact here, I was having my second daughter, my second child, for supper, and we started talking about history and the craft of the historian, and she had just read one of my texts, or rather a small, in fact it was an account of a memory of my father, who was in colonial Mozambique, and the influence that he had on my life. And it was at that point that she looked at me and she said, you've got to write, you've got to leave, now that you have written a legacy for the broader general public in the history of African decolonization, or rather more specifically, reseated the Viriamo massacre in the history of African decolonization in Mozambique, and so therefore given back to the Portuguese a history that they particularly wanted to either erase or silence. She said, well, what about a more tangible legacy that will impact us and that will tell us who we are in relation to you, as our father? Well, I think that in one sense, I think it was wonderful to hear one's child say that, but on another, it just basically dried the ink in my pen, because I immediately realized I can't write an intellectually abstract methodology book on how I did the massacre investigations and the trauma that I suffered, as a PTSD afterwards, and the impact that had, essentially on the family and on myself, which propelled, of course, me to go into therapy and do EMDR sessions, and then, of course, it led, to basically a heart attack with 2 stents now. But all of that notwithstanding, it placed me in a quandary, because up to this point I had resolutely asked, I had resolutely refused to hear what my kids were asking me to do. And my usual response was, who gives a rat's ass about my life? I've done this work, I'm a historian, here's what I've done. And that sense, kept coming back to me, and my response was always, it's rather presumptuous for somebody, to write a memoir or to write, autobiography, because frankly, it's a false narrative, largely because you engage to a very large extent in explaining away in palliatives the demons that fundamentally plunged you, into areas that exposes the fractures of your beingness and your personality. And so for the last 2 years, I think I have been sort of in this conundrum of, really seeing how could I conceivably write an authentic narrative that didn't spring from a well of either grandiosity or a well that was a finite statement of a life lived in Africa, in colonial, lived with colonial Africa, I was. And in other words, if I was to approach this subject, I needed to approach it from not necessarily intellectual positionality, which is what historians, refer to, but really trying to understand how my work how my work can be explained in terms of my lived experience. And that it needs to tie in such a way that before the readers get to it, I should experience my aha moment, that I would then say to myself as a testament, I now understand why what I did, and hopefully if I understand it, then the general reader would therefore walk the walk with me and understand it.
Okay, well, this a number of questions that what you're describing raises here. For me, it's like a two-tier question. One is, can a historian write a book of history, an account of history, that can be, while it's a narrative about facts and events and verifiable evidence that the historian presents, but at the same time this being part of his or her own story, being a subject within the context of this history that the historian is offering to the public, which leads me to think about the role that the historian must play in the larger picture, if you will. I remember we were discussing this a couple of weeks ago, where I was telling you that the general public is under the impression, at least in my view, it's under the impression that the historian's role is to go out there and seek the truth, find facts, and then simply put it together and discover the narrative that was there, and then put it in writing or in the digital form nowadays, or in front of the camera, whichever modality the historian chooses to do so. In most cases, it would be a book of history. But you had a different view of this, and kind of an enlightening moment for me when we were having this discussion about what is the role of historians. So I wonder if you can elaborate on that, given how you're speaking about your current project, the voice thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you raise about 3 issues there.
Yeah.
One issue is whether historians are hunting for truth. the next question, I think, is this view of history either viable and or possible, given, and in a way you didn't say that, but I think this is a conversation that you and I had earlier, in light of the digital age, since you mentioned about digital age, and where, you know, the production of both data is so phenomenally prolific, you know, beyond human comprehension most of the time. And then the third, I think, question is to do with the historian and the self in the historical narrative. The first question, I think it's easy to answer, and we can tap the development of history as a discipline before the 19th century and after, predominantly with the possible exception of that famous geographer and traveler, you know, from Morocco, Ibn Khaldun, who laid the foundations of the theory of society, you know, as early as the 15th century. History was either prosopographic, that is to say, a collection of individual biographies that collectively, you know, yielded a penumbral idea of society. But it was Ranke, the German historian, who asserted that a historian was fundamentally engaging in crafting, enlightening essentially the past by engaging in an omniscient exercise, in other words, finding everything about a particular subject and therefore being essentially the prophet at the podium.
So historian as the predictor of the future?
No, because that's no.
That's another problematic.
It's another problematic, I think. But Ranke was a victim. Well, wasn't a victim, but I think he was reflective, you know, of the Industrial Revolution and the industrial, you know, and the industrial Europe, where I think the notion of thoroughness was essentially chewing every single data, you know, to get to the bottom of things. Well, that's essentially unrealistic, largely because the history is not necessarily a subject matter that can be possessed by a historian, but it is essentially a subject that seeks to advance a certain set of arguments concerning the past, but in a quote-unquote collaborative and or collusive format, in a society of historians, not necessarily society in a formal sense, but society in the sense that those contributors to the historical knowledge are advancing the narrative, questioning the narrative, or indeed denying the narrative. So in a sense, I think historians are not truth seekers because from a contextual point of view, what is truthful today may well be not so at a point ahead of it or before it that a historian hasn't discovered, or that new evidence, you know, casts a different light on it, which leads one to ask: so what is really the role of the historian here? I think the role of the historian here is to be methodologically transparent and truthful. In short, your relationship with digging up data and is fairly critical in two respects. One is the transparency of the process that you have tapped those sources, their provenance, etc., and it created a culture of evidence with which you then transparently argue the case. Now, this does mean to say that if there is a historian, therefore, is truthful to what he has gleaned from a body of data, and with that body of data, he can make, or rather she or they can make arguments about, the truth within the ambit of what they have engaged in, tapped in, and with a caveat that they are open to reinterpretations, should new data emerge. So in a sense, when you asked me this question earlier, so what is the ethical parameters for a historian, in this case, if they are not, finding out about truth, Well, there are two ethical parameters that are almost go without saying. One is that before you engage in the narrative is to forewarn the readers that the body of literature on which your work is arguing the case is the following. And normally the bibliography and the index, tells you that. But in my case, I almost invariably put in front of my book, what I have researched and what are the repositories that I have either not considered, could not consider, or should be considered by somebody, later on. And so that's the first one. And the other one, I think, is something that we rarely do these days, which is, though we imply it, is to really forewarn the readers and let them know where you are. In a sense of epistemically, when I say epistemically, I mean to say, with what baggages, with what mentality, with what intellectual tools and training are you approaching the field? In many respects, I think that the historians, in many respects, what I'm saying is that historians really treat their subject matter in a presumed sense of sanctity, if you like, but stating it disallows those historians to then play footsie and hide and seek with the reader when your position changes, halfway through intellectually. Let me give you an example. Warriors at Work was a book that I had written right at the beginning, and I had just stated very categorically that I was, a Hegelian historian, and the deeper I went into the subject matter, I realized I don't think this is really how this case at least works. That the individual here is important, not because they are important per se, but because of the role they played in the process of historical change. Now, listen, I could be wrong, and I'm open to discourse on this. But not only that, but Warriors at Work also said that readers should be very careful here, because what I'm doing is investigating the possibilities of what we can know given the absence of data and archives.
Right.
But ironically, that's 40 years ago, and the book still stands, its ground. It tragically so, because the data that I was hoping would basically deny my thesis, is not forthcoming. In fact, younger scholars, have gone on to build on it, and wonderfully so. So that's one example that I was trying to say to you, over on our walk. So that answers the question really, or the first question, the what I would call the anti-Rankian, thesis. When we come down to Positionalities, which is the text that I have been sort of battling with, is that if you are a historian and if your work has tapped into a central event or set of events that are tectonically significant for, in this case, for the Portuguese departure from their colonies in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Saint Tomé, Príncipe, and Cape Verde Islands, you are in a double bind. You can't claim that your book on video. Okay, in the case of Portuguese decolonization, two events were dominant. The first was the massacre, which became an international sensation and which laid open the tectonic fissures in the Portuguese system. And the other one was really Amílcar Lopes Cabral's revolutionary movement in Guinea-Bissau, which basically convinced even the Portuguese Governor General, to really state openly in a book that he called Portugal in the Future that the war in the colonies was lost politically. And so what I'm saying to you is that I was involved in those two events, at a personal level, but also in terms of writing on this. And so in a sense, I couldn't write the role I played in those two things the way that I have just said to you, the role I played, because that is disingenuous. Even though you might have played such a role in advancing the narrative, it basically puts you ahead of the importance of the events. And so, in a sense, what I'm saying to you is that what does a historian have to do in order to acknowledge that historical forces under any circumstances are much greater than you are? And so I turned the narrative around on the book that I'm writing on, and I said, I think that what I need to do is to acknowledge the importance and the weight of the events that carried in themselves in history, but then look at how those events impacted me as a lived experience. And so in a way, it was that revelation that ultimately clicked for me, and it's only very recently that I now realize, okay, I think I have here a sketch for a book that's not going to be a memoir, but that is going to make me walk onto the pages of history as a historian and dynamically observing how those events shaped me and how I sought to understand those events as a historian. So there is this a kind of a dialogue, if you like, between the selfhood and the knowing.
Right, it's the subject and knowing, and the journey of the subject and knowing. Which, allow me, if we can shift gears a little bit, because you were discussing the ethics of a historian, and you were distinguishing between genuine work of history and the historian writing about history, and what practices can be disingenuous. Now, in the 21st century, particularly in the digital age where things are moving so rapidly that in a blink of an eye, there's a change. Tomorrow we can wake up and see a new technology transforming the way in which we live. There are two things that often irk me a bit. One is, in particular, the History Channel. Right? There's the History Channel and the cable channel where I'll put this in quotations. They have history programs, and every time I tune in or just to browse and see what's happening with the History Channel, almost every time what I see is a history of a particular war from a particular point of view. And I think this is perhaps what you were referring to as positionality. And then there's the power dynamics of who is rendering this history and who is talking about it and who's presenting it as such. And then there is the problem of artificial intelligence and all this computing that goes on with data collection and then reproducing that data by choice, extracting some parts of it and then putting together a new narrative that kind of fits this mold of the imperial's perspective on history, if you will. Does that make sense? Framing this question, how do you confront that, or do you not see it as a problem, as an ideological problem, with the role of history in the grand picture?
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, what irks you most in watching history channels is that they are seeking to appeal to the masses, and in doing so they are being either essentialists or reductionists, in that they want to present a historical narrative from the point of view of a beginning, a middle, and an end, which is storytelling, and possibly by prefacing it with let's say a rhetorical question, which then they address it in a linear fashion. Of course, that I think is an artifact that may snag people to want to read more about history or become interested in history as a discipline, and I can't address it because I don't have the figures to suggest to what extent such programs have indeed led to enrollments in history. So I don't know, but it's essentially a form of pandering, which if it serves the purpose of exposing what historians do broadly, I would suppose it's okay. I have my doubts on that front, because I think it's engaging in essentially the kind of history that is teleologic. In other words, that really seems to suggest that history is fundamentally a series of facts strung together that lead to a conclusion that that essentially is addressing a rhetorical question. And more often than not, the rhetorical question has been devised after they have concluded. So there's that. So it's not investigative. But having said that, I don't know that historians and history per se can really address issues that are by definition comfort giving to people, to the general public. Comfort giving in the sense that it would affirm in the minds of the public a position that is essentially reinforcing what that redoubtable White House civil servant or servant in last administration called alternative facts. But generally speaking, I think good history, which that is both readable and that seeks to reach a broader audience, is by definition discomforting. So give a historian two facts and they will find a third argument. I mean, because we are creatures that inhabit gray zones, and for a good reason, because unlike linear history from the History Channel, there are historical fiction writers, and they have the freedom that we as historians don't. When evidence is not there, and then there is a chronological gap, and then the narrative continues, let's say, at another point, we are ethically bound to state that, and the trail stops here, but we know that it continues over there. Whereas a historical fiction writer, can just quite simply bridge the gap, with an imaginative set of premises.
And that happens often.
So that's one thing that I think we are immensely conscious about. In the end, though, our task is really to really query the past. And our task is not deterministic, which is what you were trying to suggest as a provocative question, namely, can historians predict the future? Well, I don't think so, because if that was the case, then I think that we would be living in a world whose parameters and algorithmic constructs were predictable and could be predicted, and therefore all aspects of an event were controlled variables. And that is not the case, largely because humans are not yet AI machines. We may come at the point in time where we are cryogenically such that only a percentage of us is human and the rest it's all machine. But I don't think we have seen that future yet. So up to this point, I think it would be foolhardy to say that because I know about the Ottoman Empire, that I can make an assumption that America, is an empire that has the same parameters, parameters similar to the Ottomans, and so therefore I can predict what's going to happen to us, in the next few years. Well, I don't think so, because they are so unique. Human beings are immensely unique. I mean, you and I know that we, even ourselves, we are no longer who we are every 7 years, because every cell in our body, has changed.
That's
and
right.
with it, I think that there are genetic aberrations that come as a result of environmental issues or gene degradation that ultimately will, as a historian, will make me question. I have seen you today. In 7 years' time, I have to revise my construct, because that's the nature of human life in that sense.
So ultimately, what you're saying is that the historian always leaves the door open for revisions of the current narrative, and stays away from the dangers of even speculating about what may happen as a result, what may happen, say, 10 years from now as a result of what happened 50 years ago. Because history has proven that this is the case, that we cannot predict the future. No pun intended, of course, right? History
No.
proving itself. But you see what I'm getting at. But then there is this problem with, you mentioned the fictional historian writers that take creative license with the truth, with facts, and they can invent stories that are connected to factual events. And they have more, in terms of popular culture and the pedagogical sites in the popular culture, such as television mediums, cinema, Hollywood in particular, and as well as social media with the stories, and entertainment industry as a whole, the culture industry, if you will. They have more power to drive the message home, and so they can make all kinds of predictions. And if something coincides with what happens in the future, so see, we are the true historians, as opposed to a historian that deliberately goes after research and finding the facts and deliberating on it, and then verifying everything, and then remaining open for future evidence that may or may not come to change the narrative.
Okay, so I think you are sort of touching on, perhaps, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but from what I understand, I think here's what I hear you understand, what you are saying, though that's not what you said. One, that historians do not have an easy access to popularizing channels through which they can communicate the results of their endeavor, and even if they did, their commitment to engaging with the narrative transparently and truthfully, works against them, because the populace, wants to hear history as a binary narrative, with a moral at the end.
Well, do they want it, or is it manufactured in such a way where they're led to believe that this is how they should receive history?
Well, okay, so yeah. I think that in a sense, whatever the cause is, I think that's that seems to be reasonably. It's a reasonably. It's a reasonable assumption to make. There are two other things that are concomitant, to this. One is that as historians, we are our own worst enemy because we use short shrifts and icons and contractions of concepts that would take too long for us to explain, but that these contractions are understood, by a coven of historians or by a special subfield. And so in many respects, I think we are our own worst enemy, because I think, we should be broadening the narrative by reaching out to the public after all, and in a sense, therefore, we will be engaging in a much more of a critically evaluative civil society, and prevent the process of binary dumbing down, of it. So there's that. So that's the second part of the narrative. But then there is the element that I think plays into this, and it has to do with the fact, that historians really are, as I said earlier, leery to engage in predictions. That's true. But it does not necessarily mean that historians would not basically walk the walk with your thinking, such as, God, we are in a decline in America. And were you to ask the question, well, you are an historian, Dhada, is there anything like this that happened before? And you, as a historian, have the ethical responsibility to say, well, of all the empires that I have examined, I can tell you with some comfort that this empire went this way. But we as historians would stop there, and we would preface it by saying, you do know that we don't believe in history repeats itself, because it doesn't, because of the sheer logic, of uncontrollable variables and so forth. But that does not really prevent you from shedding a penumbral light that could conceivably facilitate you to move away from the lure of prediction and to the attractiveness of critically evaluating evidence. Let me give you an example, and then I'll come back to the what I would call the ticklish problem of the Brodelian paradigm. And I will explain what that means, so that people watching this, want to see
what is this Brodelian modality he's talking about?
I know. So let me just
present.
I know. So let me just sort of go to this. When the elections, the first set of elections some 12 plus years ago, brought Barack Obama, to the presidency in their first term, we had colleagues of ours and discussing the elections, and if you recall, we had Hillary Clinton, in a tussle with Barack Obama. Almost all of my friends, were Obama supporters. I very well understood the charismatic dynamics, of this would-be president. But as a historian, I said to everybody, when they asked me what my opinion was, I said, I don't think that he should be elected. And they were utterly shocked.
Wow.
Because
It was a radical position you took then.
yeah, and my position was based on a fairly sound grounding, what I thought was sound.
Which was?
Which was that a nation that conveniently really forgets a 15,000-year-old injustice and opts to write essentially a skin-based injustice is, to use Cicero's words, permanently lost. My feeling was, that a woman president at the time was going to be a game changer, namely that, hey, if nothing else, there would be more bathrooms for women, in Congress and the Senate, and abortion issues, and we would have had at least for 1 or 2 terms women cadres, basically rising up into the bureaucracy and political systems and so on, which would have effectively created a gravitas, for change. After all, this country's wealth is very largely in women's hands, because of legacy issues and inheritance. There are half of mankind as women, and I thought, that if we can't talk about women's liberation movement without first talking about really operational, partnership dynamics in men and women, women, leading, so that at least, we would know precisely, how the other half, leads, so that we ourselves as men would really improve, our own nature. And so, and lo and behold, I was proven right. Obama administration's first term and the second term was fundamentally kowtowing, to vested interests, and
Right. It was continuation of neoliberalism
and so on.
What Clinton had done before.
And admittedly, I think, of course, I know the Obamacare was a wonderful win, and truthfully so. And now, where did I draw this particular position? Was because the first set of systemic marginalization of women in global society began with the agricultural revolution. And know that the agricultural revolution would not have occurred had it not been for women, in terms of seed re-engineering and in terms of domestication of animals and so on. And yet, the very moment the agricultural revolution occurs, and I'm here talking, of Mesopotamia, we find that food security dramatically alters not only the type of food we are ingesting, protein-based or now carb-based, but it also dramatically increases the social changes that occur, in the area of recreational sex and of breeding. I mean, we started breeding like rabbits because we were until that point facing extinction. Well, what we all don't consider is that the human population growth at the time exponentially went up, but at the cost of women being permanently pregnant, which meant that heretofore, where they were quasi-equal partners in land tilling and agriculture, suddenly really puts women
in at the margins because they are pregnant, and men therefore assume their first supremacy, in the narrative per se.
So this is the birth of patriarchy?
Well, no, that's not necessarily. All I'm saying to you is that the displacement of labor as a result of permanent pregnancies has some major impact, that is lasting, and that marginalization has not really been addressed in their various avatars, in our society, in Western society in particular. So this is just one example. When the second Obama administration was, when he was re-elected
in 2012,
yeah.
yeah.
I wrote an article called "America, Have We Crossed the Rubicon Yet?" And I laid the foundations, of what I thought was going to be happening to America. It was one of the most dangerous exercise and anti-historical exercises I have ever done.
Right.
And what I wrote there was to suggest that I fear for the Republic, because I think that the Republic may well find itself in a predicament that sets the stage for a potential civil war. And I then went on to argue that we really needed to have a Conférence Nationale, a national conference that will re-examine the Constitution, and this would be essentially a vox populi, namely using the internet, to have everybody have a say, as opposed to white men, slave owners who excluded women, in drafting the American Constitution. It just doesn't make any sense. So I wrote this then, to my utter disappointment and sadness. We actually had then the election of Donald Trump, and then at that point I wrote a letter called "America After the Rubicon." And in it I laid essentially some scenarios that was going to be troublesome for us.
So you went against the code and actually predicted
Well,
some of the things that are actually happening today. I mean, many people argue that the United States as a society is more divided today than it ever was, even going back to the era of Civil War.
So so rightfully, with viewers, will rightfully ask, well, he's talking with a forked tongue. In my mitigation, I wasn't deploying historical knowledge per se. What I did was I actually used my ability to dig facts, but not for an historical narrative.
Right.
I was actually really sharing with people what I felt uneasy about, where we were.
Yeah.
Is it a piece of historical prediction? Zero. Does it have a merit as a historical text? Not really. Historians are not really, unfractured creatures that, where their message and them as putative prophets, are the same. I mean, you have to. I mean, I have a life as a sculptor, and I have a life as a public intellectual that has nothing to do with history.
Exactly right. That's what I was thinking. Was it a work of historian? No, but did it have value? Specifically the two articles that you wrote, absolutely, because any intellectual, whether you're a professor, an author, or someone of scholarly stature, and then you work in the public, I think, in my opinion, we all have a moral obligation to become the public intellectuals and to voice our point of view and risk being, ostracized, attacked against, or even celebrated, or a mixture of all. But it is our obligation if we're thinking deeply about the human condition, and we care deeply about the human condition. I think our time is running out a bit, and I hope that we can, because we can sit here and talk for hours upon hours, as we have done in the past, but not with the camera turned on. I want to thank you for giving me the honor and the opportunity to engage you in dialogue in a public forum, and I look forward to our future dialogues together in different modalities, whatever that may be.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that I was able to share what really sort of troubles me or troubled me in the past, and how I think historians have the burden of seeking transparently things that may or may not have happened, and sharing it in a user-friendly way. I think that's the problem that I think most of us as in the profession have. We just think really that an intellectual argument or an argument with the past must be inaccessible, as opposed to being tangibly felt by one's gut with the very first few words that you utter on a page.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
The work must be accessible to public at large.
And there is a way of actually doing that without engaging really in code words and so on.
Well, thank you.
Good.
Okay, so